David, thank you for taking the time to talk to us on Green Fridays. Congratulations on the impressive transformation of An Post, which has not only established itself as a leading business in Ireland with deep community connections, but is also ranked third in its sector worldwide for sustainability, an impressive achievement. David, today I would like to focus on the E in ESG with a particular focus on environmental sustainability. Looking back then to when you started with An Post, could you tell me about how your sustainability journey started?
Well, it started, and it's a story I love to tell. It started when I'd been An Post about a month, and the whole journey of An Post, like most postal, is moving from a letters organisation to an e-commerce parcels organisation, and parcels can't be delivered on bicycles, and so you need vans. And I got a purchase order for 750 diesel vehicles to go on the streets of Dublin, and I said, there's no way we can do this, and we must get some electric vehicles. And they came back and said, well, 740 diesel and 10 electric. I'm going, do the electric vehicles work? Is anybody using them? They said, yeah, we test them, Deutsche Post using them. I said, make it 750 electric vehicles. And that really was the start of certainly in ESG, the E part. Although that was only 2016, it wasn't in the consciousness nearly as much then. And, for me, it was more of an old-fashioned thing, which is, we now talk about climate action. Then we talked about pollution, to reduce pollution. And, so it's, while on the one hand, a lot of what has been done in climate action is new, I mean, we can trace it all the way back. You can trace it back to in history, and history's my thing, and the pea supers in London, you trace it back to pandemics, the Spanish flu, you trace it back to TB in Ireland, to all of the things that that were signs of an unhealthy environment, an unhealthy life. And so I don't think I saw climate action as being that different. Now, of course, the science says it's of a more dramatic impact. It's also of a more ubiquitous impact. It can't be escaped. But nonetheless, it's still about, do we have a good environment? Is what we are doing contributing to a healthy environment?
Yes, and talking about the environment, I know you've taken up a partnership with Amazon, a climate pledge. Would you like to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, the climate pledge, Amazon is our probably our largest single supplier, is largest single customer, and we deliver a lot for Amazon. Amazon themselves realize that they have quite a way to go to make sure that they meet climate targets, not least because of Amazon Web Services and data centers, and the only license, if you are going to operate in industries like logistics, like data centers, etc., the only license is that you work doubly hard and you double down to make sure that you're responsible citizens with the environment. And I think that's what Amazon is trying to do. It's certainly what we are trying to do. We probably come from a different perspective because we're publicly owned, we're owned by the state, and our purpose it's a little clearer for us, our purpose, which is to act for the common good. But I also work in the private sector, and the private sector I see as often somewhat ahead of the public sector in terms of this, because the private sector realizes that investors won't invest, particularly, the biggest investors in the world are pension funds, teachers' pension funds, municipal workers' pension funds, and these groups aren't going to invest in companies who are bad actors, so I think there's a number of different motivations, whether motivation is an altruistic one to act for the common good, or whether it's one to protect a share price and drive investment. It doesn't really matter as long as I outcome is going to be the same, which is much better practices in terms of our planet.
Yes, for sure. And talking of better practices, and we're talking about Amazon there, have An Post plans to decarbonise its fleet. I guess that's an important thing we're looking at.
Yeah, look, our targets are clear. It's based on 2008, is baseline 50% carbon emission reduction by 2025 and net zero by 2030. We're on target, in fact probably slightly ahead of target, to have 50% reduction by 2025. We've driven as much of the fleet as we probably can to be electric at the moment, which is called in postal, it's called the last mile. As much of the last mile fleet is now electric. It's difficult in some in some rural areas where the routes are too long, where the charging infrastructure is too poor. And those are issues we have to overcome, but they're gradually being overcome. The technology is improving dramatically in terms of range of batteries, etc. So we will get there, but we've done as much at the moment as we can of that fleet. The difficulty for us is our mid-mile fleet, which is the heavy goods vehicles, the HGVs. Our response at the moment is to use biofuels for them, and biofuels will take out about 85% of carbon. But there's some issues emerging around whether biofuels really are that ethical. Whether there's no point if the biofuels are from palm oil. There's not a lot of point because the growth of palm oil is as damaging. So there's always these complexities, but we keep trying and we keep pushing. And the target to 2030 is, with the hydrogenated vegetable oil, HVO, in the mid-mile fleet, with more of the last mile fleet, we should get to somewhere around 95-96% reduction of our emissions. Then the last 4% will have to find some way of offsetting, and I've just come back from a conference in Copenhagen looking at offset, saying we need to develop offsets that actually really work, that are real, that are ethical, that contribute. There's no doubt that nature and biodiversity in those areas are probably the best offsets. You've got to, I believe very, very strongly in decent work, in employees having decent pay, decent pensions, being able to afford houses. If you don't have that, there's no point talking about the great work you're doing in climate action if the workers are having to pay for it by having poor conditions or poor pay or whatever. So they do all link.
Sure. And I can imagine that the work that you guys have done on biodiversity, that has improved your employees' life as well, because it improves the green spaces for them. So not only helping nature, but helping your employees.
Well,
You've
remember,
done a lot of work on biodiversity, I think.
Postal is unique, maybe not unique, but certainly at an extreme in terms of outdoor work. Every morning 5,500 postmen and postwomen pick up the mail at 6:30 a.m., 7 a.m, and then they outside delivering in all whatever the weather. It's very connected to nature. Postal is very connected to our environment. And again, it's something which we remember. Now, we've a lot of work to do. We've got major processing centres. These are the huge centres that process parcels and letters, and I think we've a lot more work to do with them in terms of the environment around them. We've experimented with what we call our DSUs, what colloquially would be called the local sorting office. We've 120 of them now. We've experimented, we've tested in a couple of them. What can we do better in terms of solar panels, in terms of planting, in terms of whatever. And we're getting good results from that, but we need to roll that out and roll it out pretty fast. So while I say we're doing these things, some we're behind on, and I'd like us to move much faster on them.
So what percentage of your buildings do you think have solar panels, or what's your goal perhaps to have in terms of cleaner energy sources?
Well, our goal is always to use clean energy, and we use, wherever we are, we use clean energy. So we pay more for our energy so that it's clean energy, and that we use, but that's from the grid. We will, we are installing solar panels, but it's a relatively small percentage at the moment. We want to roll that out much more. We definitely want to experiment more with our own energy production. And the great thing about solar is then you can feed it back into the grid. And the other interesting thing is that some of our power usage is at different times to domestic usage, overnight, in the middle of the night, charging vehicles, etc. So there's lots of options for us, and there's a great team here who are expert, who make those choices, but we can constantly improve, and we are improving. I mean, the really essential thing is that it's a priority, that people see it as a priority. And if people see it as a priority, anything people anywhere see as a priority, they usually solve. It's usually because it's not a priority that things don't happen.
How would you say that the culture, you're talking about making sustainability a priority, how much would you say that sustainability is a priority in An Post?
It's absolutely a priority. It's a priority because we've such a footprint. We're in every town and village, but we start really with the United Nations goals, which really are about the broader aspect. As I say, decent work is one of our goals. It's essential that if our postmen and women in Bandon can stay in Bandon and have a decent life there, and that's the core of sustainability. It's about the work we do with communities. We connect with communities, and I always think there's something unusual about An Post. We're seen as the benign arm of the state. That's why we did the work to codify that, and we codified it as saying we act for the common good now and for generations to come. The common good is our star. Now is a sense of urgency, and generations to come is all about sustainability. There's no point doing things now if it's not going to last. So I think for postal, and you see it in other postal organisations in Europe, see it more in some than others, but it's a pretty big force, and it kind of defines what we do. So it's absolutely a priority, and we know that, and partly it stems from the fact that we ourselves, face an existential threat. People stop sending letters. Letters are declining each year. We're not going to exist, so we're now into e-commerce, very heavily into e-commerce. So it's about our own sustainability. Now, you can't be in e-commerce if you don't counter that with the responsibility to act sustainably. So, we're putting a lot of work at the moment into circular economy, and we need to develop that. I think we've been too slow to develop it. We need to develop it way faster. And that's the key to getting e-commerce to work sustainably. Now, there's actually some interesting studies that say that shopping online is more sustainable than shopping bricks and mortar, because you don't have a whole load of people going out on journeys. You've just one person doing a journey, dropping off parcels. Now, you can always make statistics work which way. So I'm not sure how true it is. And the point is that any truck roll is using energy. Consumption is an issue. There's a whole load of issues. So we've got a lot of work to work through those. E-commerce, there's good e-commerce, but there's e-commerce that may be not sustainable, and we've got to work our way through that.
And you mentioned the circular economy. Could you talk a little bit more about what you mean about the circular economy?
Well, circular economy is all about reuse. It's reinvention and repurposing. And for us, it's everything from our buildings. We're just developing a program at the moment on responsible divestment of buildings. You know, we've a lot of old buildings in towns throughout Ireland. They're not suitable for us anymore, but we're not just going to abandon them or just sell them to anybody. We want to make sure they're reused responsibly. So that's an example. But in relation to consumers, it's all about reuse of reselling, for example, clothing, which is a very big movement now. Vinted is probably the fastest growing site in Europe. It's from Lithuania. And, you know, if you look at what Vinted does and what others do, I was amazed that, you know, now looking at the statistics, we're heading towards 10% of e-commerce being what's called consumer to consumer. That's people selling to people. And 90% of that is probably 100%, I'm saying 90%, probably 100% is reuse. That's circular economy. It means you're not manufacturing, remanufacturing, you're not starting from scratch. You're reusing, and that is extremely sustainable. And it's also perhaps socially good. It connects people. And you know, so I think that's becoming a very big movement. So if that's becoming in Europe close to 10% of e-commerce, then it's going to be 15% in 3, 4, 5 years' time. Now that's very substantial, very substantial. And so that's a really big area for us to develop, and we need to develop it rapidly. And you know, we've identified it. We've just done our new 5-year strategy, and at the core of it is C2C. And I'm very excited by that. I'm excited by what it can do for people, for the idea that, you know, our purpose, I say, is to act for the common good. Our meaning is really to help people trade. You know, help people trade, help people buy things, help people sell things, help companies buy things, help companies sell things, move things around. That's what we do. There are trade-offs that are really difficult. You know, I've currently got a purchase order for replacement of fleet, and you know, 50% is electric, but 50% is diesel, and they're saying they have to have it for rural areas. Now, I would certainly like, what I would like from government, I don't want money from government for us, but you know, we need the charging infrastructure in this country. It's absolutely vital we get that in place. And now, not in 5 years' time or 10 years' time, but now, you know, and this year, get it in this year. Now, if government wants to talk to me about it, I'll do it, you know, we'll do it, and get things done and go ahead with it and not allow, you know, planning delays and all of that. Now, there's power issues and ESB, you know, they have to upgrade parts of their network, and all of that needs to be done in a way. But you can find a million reasons for not doing it now, but the reason for doing it now is if you can, you know.
You mentioned in the COVID that you had sent postcards, and I know that it's a slightly different area as well, but back to maybe biodiversity. And you had a campaign last year all around biodiversity, and I know you sent out postcards. How did that campaign work?
I think it worked, and you know, a lot of what we have to do is raise awareness. You know, one of the things that I think is a bit of a mistake around the green movement, the sustainability movement, is people have been very po-faced and serious and saying they're against greenwashing. I think greenwashing is a brilliant thing, because what it does is it raises, the whole point about greenwashing is it's marketing green activities. Now, of course, what it means is they're doing that and then you're not doing the stuff behind. You're not really reducing carbon emissions, etc. And of course that's wrong. So I know kind of what they mean by it, but be careful not to damn people. You know, people don't have to be serious all the time. If we send out a postcard with pictures of bees on it and say, or you know, no mow May, you know, if we send that out, you can accuse that of greenwashing. I think it's really good. I think it raises awareness for people. You know, that awareness now, most people know that actually, you know, this is not the right time of year to be mowing your lawn really tight because bees require it. And, you know, that's fantastic. So And we'll do more this year. We're going to do a big cleanup campaign on beaches and rivers, which we'd like to do because I think that's a part of our environment that we've perhaps neglected. So, we can keep doing those things. They're not expensive to do. It's just about, do you care? And can you let people know? And I think that really matters. I think that linking with people, because essentially people want clean beaches, they want biodiversity, they want bees pollinating plants. People want these things. You're not asking people to do things they don't want, so why not?
Do you get pushback though from people who say, we don't think that the areas look so neat and tidy anymore? Do you get that sort of feedback sometimes? Or are people more understanding that perhaps things don't have to look so neat and tidy?
Yeah, I think you get some pushback in that. I think people are getting used to that, and our aesthetics change, our aesthetics change in terms of landscape and environment, which is quite interesting. I think and by the way, we do very little in this area. The people who really do the work are local councils. I mean, my own council in Dunleary have done unbelievable work in planting, and if we all of that intent, the country will be great, be way better. So look, we do very little in that regard, but if we'll do what we can, and it's not in a sense my job to rewild the environment, but we'll do what we can to let people know and also make it a bit of fun.
And looking ahead, what are the biggest challenges you anticipate in expanding on PUS's sustainability efforts?
I think certainly finding a solution to our HGV fleet. That's a really important part. That's the most immediate piece because that we need to hit our emissions targets. But I think we'll get there. More broadly, we need to develop circular economy to a deeper level, not just consumer to consumer, but understanding packaging, waste, and that really needs to be tackled in an industry for e-commerce. I think then you get into really deep areas. You have the whole issue of Scope 3 emissions, and then you move beyond that into the value chains, the sustainable financing, and that's quite difficult because now, I've got to ask myself the question, am I responsible for what consumers buy? Now, I don't think so. I think I should be agnostic. Our job is to deliver, and our job is to help people trade. But at some point, that's going to clash and come into question. And, I think there is a danger that all of the EU directives are going to be overly bureaucratic, overly about measurement, and that will just stop activity. It's sclerotic. People are just spending their times just setting up accounting, and I'm having to hire specialist accountants and everything. I realise things need to be measured, but that I think could really slow things down. Regulation isn't always the answer. So I worry about that. I really worry about that. And certainly from what I've seen from some of the EU directives or planned directives, they're not really possible. It's not really possible to do some of these things. I understand the theory, but we've got to get towards good practice and how does that work. I think the other thing is, the playing field has to be level. I cannot be punished for being a sustainable company because others decide not to be sustainable, are driving 20-year-old diesel vans, are paying people low wages, gig economy. That's not right. But they'll win the big contracts.
So could you do with more government regulation perhaps in that regard?
I think there is a need for some regulation in that. I mean, I certainly, and I've always been very vocal about regulation about gig economy. Now, I understand there's certain areas that more historically, such as hospitality, work in a certain way. I understand that there's certain groups, students, etc., who benefit from it. But that isn't what most gig work is. Most gig work is avoiding giving people decent pensions, giving them looking after sick pay, looking after holiday pay. And that's wrong, and that needs to be. And I know that Leo Varadkar had talked about introducing legislation on it and against zero-hour contracts, but we need to see more on that. Because that's my start in any conversation. You can talk to me about carbon emissions. I'm going to start in decent work, because if people can't lead decent lives from their employment, then it's for naught. So, but then in relation to carbon emissions, yeah, I absolutely think there should be, and there will have to be carbon taxes. You can't change it without that. Now, the issue with that is they've got to be fair. They've got to be, they've got to make sure that they're progressive. That people who, that the affordability is taken into account, etc. But that's all to be designed.
Oh, great. On a more personal note, I know that you've been very much on the leading edge of sustainability before a lot of people were even talking about it, and I'm just wondering what has driven your interest in sustainability from such an early stage.
I think I left Ireland and went to London and worked in London and worked in bookstores, and was one of the people who worked at Waterstones, one of the people who helped grow that business into big business. And that as a business was all about bringing great books to cities that didn't have decent bookstores anymore. And that, that's a really sustainable activity. And it's in that broader sense of social good and connection, but also commercially viable and grew and was very successful. I worked with a lot of young British people, and I think Britain was ahead of the game in those days. I'm not so sure now, but certainly in those days, Britain was ahead of the game. And as a society, had a very strong green pull to it. And certainly in London, a lot of my friends, my wife, people around me would have been much greener than me. So I guess, by osmosis, I pick it up there. But also it's interesting, and then it just kind of makes sense. The interesting thing for me was coming back to Ireland, and I worked in Aircom, and I think it was overly aggressive at the time in terms of being this was in 2000 to 2006, and very profit driven, and I'm lucky I made some money there, but maybe too much so, and maybe it's about getting older, is you get a broader sense that we're here for society, we need a decent society, I benefit from it, I want my children to benefit from it, I want us all to benefit from it, and we all want to work at that. A fascinating one for me though was, I ran TV3, young company, couldn't pay people much money, we had very little money, but we all worked together and got our way through the global financial crisis, and then sold it, and then I came to Unpus. It's the first time I worked in the public sector, and boy did I get an education from the unions, and the unions were quite clear. I remember a huge row with them. They said, do not bring in yellow pack workers, do not try and reduce, it's first thing, you look at your costs, and financially we were in a bad way, what could we do? And they were absolutely clear, you're not going to do it, that's a red line. And they educated me in that. And so, I'd like to think I've always believed in decent work, which I have, but actually putting some metrics around that, the unions have helped with that. And so, I'm constantly learning and developing, and if you listen to people around you, you can kind of get that sense as to what's right and what's wrong in terms of what we do.
Finally, have you any thoughts or advice for businesses or individuals on how they can have a positive impact on the environment?
Well, firstly, they can. Everybody can. Everybody has a role to play. And enjoy it. It's a lot of fun. And it has to be driven from the top. Don't ghettoize it. It has to be driven from the top. And everybody has to believe it. But I try, now it's difficult because of all the EU directives, I try not to get too hung up on the metrics. I think sometimes there's too much emphasis on the metrics, what's the X emissions, X tons, all of that. That doesn't really connect with anyone. It doesn't connect with customers. It doesn't connect with employees. We did one thing where we put beehives in the roof of the GPO and made honey. That connects with employees. Now, you can say, well, that does nothing for the environment and everything. Yes, it does, because it gets people aware. And once you get people aware and they get interested, then you can move into other areas in terms of emissions and in terms of biodiversity and in terms of the really big, heavy lifting areas. So I wrote in our sustainability report last year, I'd like to think that we're human about sustainability. It's all about human interaction and human touch. The science really matters, but if you lead on the science, I don't think you're going to bring people with you. So I'd think about what can you do to bring people with you.
Great. David, thank you so much for talking to us today. Thank you very much.